Hello, everybody. So I'm just wanted to make this short little video on tastes that we want to favor in the fall and why we would want to favor those tastes in the fall. So this was our little document here, and I'm just going to head down to that section. So in Ayurveda, first off, we have six tastes that we take a look at. And all of those six tastes have different actions and different roles to play within the digestive system. And they also are make different parts of the digestive system as well. So I'm going to talk about the first few here. So what we have is sweet taste. Sweet taste builds tissues, it's lubricating and it's very grounding, but the sweet taste is the first stage of digestion. So that would be the tongue. Everything that gets nice and juicy on the tongue, that's when saliva starts to happen. And that's when the sweet taste, it's a very juicy, it's water and earth. So it's a very juicy taste. So that's what's happening then. So we want to make sure that we have all that saliva. If we have something going off in that first part of digestion, for example, a dry mouth, then we're not going to produce those digestive enzymes properly. We might have some issues with malabsorption, things like that. So we want to make sure that we do get sweet taste. But the reason why sweet taste is great in the fall is because the fall and winter is a cold, dry, light time of year. And sweet taste, although cooling, is very moist and heavy and grounding and nourishing. So that's why we want to bring in some sweet taste. Any examples of sweet taste? That doesn't necessarily mean, like chocolate bars and things like that. Really, most things are actually sweet taste according to Ayurveda. All grains, lentils, beans, nuts, meat, yogurt, fruits, things like that. There are many of which actually have that sweet sort of anabolic building taste. The next one is the sour stage of digestion. The sour stage is the second stage. What does sour do in the body? Sour is here. I have it underneath salty, but sour is secreting. So that's the stage that's pretty hot, and that's where those digestive enzymes start to fire. Hydrochloric acid in the stomach starts to get excreted from the walls of the stomach, and that is a metabolic action. That's the action where we start to turn nutrients and break them down. Okay, because when we have the big foods and we put it in our stomach, we need to break down all of those nutrients. So that's essentially the first stage of the breakdown of that metabolic process. And why would we want this in the summer, in the winter, I guess we could say, sorry, is because again, the winter is very dry and light, and the sour is going to give us that juiciness. It's going to crank up the heat a little bit. It gives us that warm, juicy. So remember when we talked about our digestion here, if we come back up, we want it to be warm, we want it to be juicy. So the sour can really help with that as well. What are sour things? As we can see here, we have some lemons, maybe limes, tomatoes, things like that. Any type of ferment, so like kombucha, things like that. Being mindful of kombucha, we don't want to drink the whole bottle. When having kombucha, we don't need a whole lot of sour taste to produce that secretagogue effect. So something to be mindful of. We don't want to create a sour environment, because then if our environment is too sour, we might experience things like tongue ulcers, or like those mouth ulcers, or even just ulcers anywhere in the body. We might experience some fermentation, so maybe some gas and some bloating and things like that. So something to be mindful of. The next taste and the next part of digestion, again, is a hot, more watery part. And this is sort of lower in the lower part of the stomach. So we have the mouth with the sweet taste. We have sort of the upper part of the stomach where it starts to kind of shoot out secretagogue, some of that, those digestive enzymes. Well, the salty part is like the watery, juicy part, that lower third of the stomach. And again, it's still hot because in the stomach, we need that heat to break down nutrients. But what does salt do? Salt is very hydrating. So it's going to hold the water. So we can think about the stomach holding a third of water. That's what salt does. Salt also draws water to it. So if you have a dry digestive system, a dry stomach, how would we know that, right? things like gas, bloating, dry mouth. Maybe you have a dry elimination as well, where it's constipation, but constipation with dry rabbit pellet stools that are hard to pass, that take a lot of work to pass, and maybe don't pass for days. Those are some indications of dryness. Again, another quality of fall season, of winter season. So we need to draw water in, right? So that's why we want the salty taste. Salty taste, we see, of course, salt, any type of salts, pink Himalayan salt, there's like black salt, black rock salt, there's different types of salts, not necessarily like table salt. We want one that has more mineral content, a higher mineral content. It also can help with absorption as well. So we need, remember, that juicy environment to help us to absorb as well. Celery, seaweed can be really salty. So those are some things there. Those three tastes are the first three parts in the digestive process, the three stages in the digestive process, and ones that we would want to favor in the winter, but it doesn't mean ones that we want to only eat and totally ignore the others. Because remember, all six tastes have different action in the body, have different action in the digestive process as well, so are quite important. So all this really means is that maybe our meals can contain a little bit more of these three and a little bit less of the others. But of course, it really depends. Now, one thing that I should mention before we move down to the next three tastes is that essentially each meal should incorporate all six of those tastes. And why is that? Typically for satiation, right? To help us feel satisfied when we've had our meal. Sometimes if you're lacking some salt, you might be like, well, I need some chips. I need something salty to eat, right? If you're having a meal that is just completely bitter stuff, then you might be like, well, I want some dessert after, or I want something sweet. So we always kind of want what we might be lacking in the taste within that particular meal. And it's really quite easy to get all of those tastes in there, I should mention. All of the recipes on Joyful Belly is really great at bringing in all of the six tastes. And many times when we bring in all the six tastes, a lot of foods have multiple tastes. And particularly, a lot of culinary spices have many of those tastes. So cooking with more spices is a great way to bring in more taste because, again, we don't need a whole lot of the bitter of the astringent, typically. So, tastes to incorporate. These are all of our tastes. So, what's missing? We had sweet, first stage. We had sour, second stage. We have salty, third stage. The next stage is going to be that pungent stage. So, K2 in Sanskrit terms. So, what does pungent mean? This is when it moves down essentially into that small intestine. The small intestine is that stage of digestion where we start to absorb all nutrients. Not all, but many, the bulk of nutrients. We start to metabolize and break down proteins in the stomach, but in the small intestine, this is when it does all of that really good work, right? Where we start to absorb more of the nutrients. So, stomach metabolic breaking down, small intestine continuing to break down. If we have issues breaking it all down in the stomach, then we might see things like duodenal ulcers. We might see things like SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine, right? Which is part of the word, part of the name of the condition. But if we have some things going wrong, then we might see those types of things in that pungent stage. So this is a hot stage. This is hot, not as hot as the stomach, but still hotter considering when we move down into the colon as well, because it's that metabolic process where now we're taking those foods and we are creating new, we are absorbing those nutrients to create new tissues. So this is also a very important aspect. It's going to help us to burn some of those toxins. So, if you're feeling like you have some extra metabolic waste in your body. Maybe you just are feeling a little bit sluggish, a little bit blah, a little bit puffy. This pungent taste is going to help to burn all of those toxins. It's very penetrating and it's very stimulating. Now think about if you get too much pungent taste, like up here we have these chilies, oh, too hot, right? So we know that we don't need a whole lot of this taste to create this action. So something to be mindful of, especially in the winter. Yes, we do want the pungent taste because we want the pungent taste to warm the body. But when we get too much pungent and too much heat creates or causes dryness. So something to be a little bit mindful of. But again, if you're just using it in spices, then that's just that little bit to kind of amp it up. And of course, go to what works for you. Maybe cayenne pepper, way too hot. Cardamom or cinnamon, much more gentle. Still has that pungent taste. Fennel, which seems a little bit more cooling, also has a pungent taste. So really, we can find different levels of pungency, which is awesome as well. So the next stage here would be our bitter stage. And this would come into sort of, I would say, more of the lower part of the small intestine / the first part of our large intestine. So on the right side of our body, if we feel down by that right hip, that's where the cecum is going to be. That's where our appendix is as well. And so the food or the contents of your large intestine have to come all the way up and then cross and then draw down. So this is more the bitter stage. This is the air and ether stage. What happens in this stage is that, and what happens with this taste is that bitter moves things. Bitter promotes peristalsis. So, and essentially peristalsis happens, everywhere essentially in the body because it's that smooth muscle action contraction that's involuntary that just naturally happens. But if we're not getting a whole lot of bitter taste, then we might have sluggish peristalsis. And if we have sluggish peristalsis, we might notice it. It's a good way to notice would be in the bowels and elimination. Elimination might be really slow. It might feel like it comes out very, very slow and is sticky and it's incomplete, right? That can be an indication of low peristalsis. It can also be an indication of, I was going to say, more constipation and like dry rabbit pellet stools, but essentially that is typically a little bit more like a colic, meaning that it's not like a smooth symmetry happening with the peristalsis. It's kind of like, and then stops. And then, like it's all over the place. It's not like nice and rhythmic. So bringing in some bitter taste is a really great thing that we can do to help keep things moving. And that's why a lot of people tend towards coffee because it is a very strong bitter and a very strong pungent that's going to heat things up almost to the point where you're turning your oven on to broil and then get things moving like crazy. So it's almost like too much, right? So just something to be mindful of when you decide to go back to coffee, maybe just ease into it. And there's some different options that we can do for that as well. What else does bitter do? Bitter is air and ether. So it does help to, and here I have drain dampness, and this is more of like a TCM type term, but essentially what that means is that when we have too much damp in the body, that we might feel kind of like that sogginess, where you push and it sort of feels soggy. Well, we want to drain that out, and essentially we want to eliminate that as well. And so bitter can help with that too. Bitter can help to drain lymphatic system because, again, that movement action. It also promotes downward movement. So it helps with that elimination of waste as well. The sixth taste is the astringent taste. Astringent is the last part of the digestive process, essentially in the most of the colon. I know we're kind of like, it's a bit of a funky area with like the bitter, but this is when everything dries up and tightens. So this is when we're forming our stool. Also, we have absorption that happens in the colon as well, particularly calcium. So if the bowels are too soggy or if the bowels are too dry, either way, it might draw calcium from the bones because that's where calcium is sort of absorbed. But if there's not enough calcium in that section of the colon, then it doesn't help with that sort of tightening process, if that makes sense. So essentially, astringents. What would astringent taste be? Here, we have astringent as like a pomegranate. Think about astringent as something that you try and it's so dry, it feels like cotton mouth. It feels like you want to just spit it out because you do. So obviously you're not going to have your whole dish with something astringent, right? You're just going to have a little bit. But what stringent does is stringent tightens and tones tissues. So it essentially helps with the not quantitative tissue, but more the qualitative tissue, the quality of the tissue. So it helps to give it strength in a sense by drying things up and removing things. So if your system is on the drier side, then we don't want a whole lot of astringent, right? We want to draw more water, we want to juice things up a little bit. But if your system is more on the soggier side or the hotter side, then we definitely want to dry things up a little bit and tone them as well. So it helps to make our organs function better, which is what I mentioned here. So we want to have all of those 6 tastes in our meals. One more thing that we're going to jump down to now is preparation, right? And we've talked about this in our little mini reset. But the winter is the time when you probably want to stay in and you want to have more home cooked meals. And why is that? Because it's cold outside, right? It's cold, it's dry, it's light, it's erratic. Especially, if you're living in a northern winter, then it can be all over the place. And so we want warmth, we want juiciness. So for preparations, the biggest thing that I would say is, make sure that you cook your food, that you use some nice warming spices. Again, cooking the oils and ghee, which are things that we've talked about in the within all of the soup recipes, things like that. Hearty vegetables here is what I also have. And all of these are all sweet taste, by the way, but sweet taste that also have benefit, right? I know that it can be really tricky because a lot of times, we have this fear of sweet taste because it's going to make us fat, or we have this fear of fat because it's going to make us fat, right? But that sweet taste and the fat is what provides us with lubrication. It provides us with nourishment. So it's not to say to have it in excess, it's to have the right types of sweets. And the right types of sweets would be from these heartier vegetables. If you eat meat, from meat as well. But again, preparing, right? And cooking them well and chewing them well. All of those things are really important any time of the year, and most particularly in the fall and in the winter when we tend towards that dryness, when we tend towards a weaker, more irregular digestion. So I'm hoping that you all enjoyed that. And if you have any questions whatsoever, please reach out to me. Thank you.